So, new topic for conversation. It's something I've been thinking quite a bit about, but maybe I could get a little conversation going here. I think a lot of artists feel a little stilted or stifled lately, and I think we're all hyper aware of how the creative process suffers when one walks on eggshells. So, in the current climate of sort of cancel culture, revisionist history, and in a good way, trying to clean up our language so that marginalized or oppressed communities don't endure more pain, right, at the hands of irresponsible language. It's all good progress, but sometimes, when you get into figurative territory regarding language, there's room for error. And when we sort of walk on eggshells and just treat language clinically, it's death to the creative process. So bear with me a little bit. I'll give some examples. But first, maybe consider that language is largely figurative. There's cultural relativity with regard to any word you could choose. There's always connotation in addition to denotation. There's cultural relativity, and then there's always a metaphorical level to words. And that's what I'm calling figurative as opposed to literal. Language is largely figurative. So when we're clinical about it, it just, to me, takes the fun out of life and it takes the fun out of the creative process, because arguably poetry is only created when we use language figuratively. I'm going way out on a limb here. And, the definition of poetry is open-ended as well. But I guess the reason it came up for me is I was formulating something in my mind. I hadn't even put pen to paper yet, but I was sort of conceiving something, and I was tempted to use the word myopic in my head. And I was wanting it to mean not looking beyond the end of one's nose or being literally short-sighted. But then I thought, well, wow, myopic could be really offensive to somebody, to a blind person. It could sort of perpetuate that pain body that we were talking about. And that's understandable. I then thought, well, deaf. We often say, the colloquialism, it fell on deaf ears. We often use it figuratively. She was deaf to or blind to ... the circumstances right around her. She was deaf to the feedback, or again, fell on deaf ears. So I thought, well, to a hearing impaired person, that is the perpetuation of a negative connotation associated with that word. But where do we draw the line? I think if you're my age, you didn't think twice. And forgive me in advance, it's almost like using the N-word. I've got to do it to make my point. In the 70s, you didn't think twice about saying, oh, come on, that's lame. That idea is lame. Or, you're retarded. Shut up, you're retarded. Like, you didn't, for that matter, I'm a gay man, so I guess I'm allowed to say this. A fag was, shut up, fag. That was the worst thing you could call a person. It was the opposite of cool. So, of course, in a good way, we're cleaning up our language. And we're being more respectful, right, of marginalized and oppressed communities. But where, right, do we draw the line? I think deaf and blind are great examples of how they have a figurative meaning in literature and have for, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but probably millennia, if not centuries. Certainly for decades and centuries. I'll go that far. Anyway, something to think about, when does political correctness, and it's not even ironically politically correct to use that term anymore, but when does wokeness sort of rob all creativity, the creative process itself, but certainly art and literature, of its figurative power? I just had the thought, cruelty-free language. I think that's where we're headed. We're cleaning up our vernacular, right, to create cruelty-free language. So, recently I watched an episode of I Love Lucy. Seems rather, right, innocuous, benign, non-threatening. But you hear the words bomb and hobo thrown around pretty willy-nilly, and I just don't think you would say that. For that matter, homeless this week is now the unhoused. So there's a lot of very well-warranted language policing going on in areas like that. But I wrote an entire story called The Trollop, the Hobo, and the Dandy. And the idea was, there's an older character who had seen the world change immensely, and I'm already there, trust me, at a little over half a century. The changes are astounding during my own lifetime. But specifically, norms and mores to do with language. So in her world, she would have said hobo, trollop, and dandy without batting an eye. And now it's the unhoused, and you wouldn't say trollop, you'd say the sex worker, and the dandy would be the homosexual. So let's just take trollop. That's arguably slut-shaming, right? It's really just more patriarchal oppression of female sexuality. There are so many words. Trollop, strumpet is my favorite. Tramp, harlot, whore, right? So many. And some of them seem benign, and some of them, it's hard to wrap your mind around that at any given time in history, it was remotely appropriate. So another example, that seems rather innocuous, you would say the invalid, referring to a family member if they were a shut-in. That's another one with a really negative connotation. You could say the undesirable, referring to certain subsections of the population. You could say spinster without even remotely fearing that you're denigrating the single population of the world. I love that we're more considerate now of others with a different experience than ourselves. I read 12 Years a Slave recently. I had seen the movie, it rocked my world, decided to read it from the horse's mouth. It's amazing how vivid and immediate things become, right? And the decades since the setting of the book dissolve. Time means absolutely nothing, and you're really in that place. So I became hyper aware that throughout slavery, especially during abolition, people knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly what human rights they were squelching. They knew exactly the personal liberty that an entire population were being robbed of. Our entire country was founded on the idea of individualism and personal liberty. So everybody that turned a blind eye knew exactly what kind of moral infraction they were committing. It becomes very immediate when you read the accounts of slaves. There are literally audio recordings you can listen to from freed slaves who very much remember their bondage. I encourage you to listen to some of that stuff because you will develop the opinion probably that I did, which is anyone who passively or actively contributed to that climate knew exactly what they were doing. Okay, there you go. Bye-bye.